Well, thank you very much for that very nice introduction. And I'm going to, I decided that I was going to try and give you an overview of our project and a lot of the findings that are coming out of it today. So I will keep within my time period, but I'm going to kind of cover a number of different topics. And if you see me fast forwarding, it just means I'm realizing that I was overly ambitious. So I want to start out by saying that this is by a very big team effort of people working on this project, and I acknowledge our funders there. And I would like to say that the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton has been making it very difficult for us to get our work done, because as soon as we add a PI, they become the dean and then go on to become the president. But we're soldiering on, even though the Wilson School has been making it hard. So the study that I'm going to talk to you about today is following a little bit over 1,000 community college students who were enrolled in Delgado and Louisiana Technical College. And I and my collaborators fell into this project. If you know my work, it's on immigration mostly and race and ethnicity, and found myself in this disaster business. Because I was part of a research network on the transition to adulthood, and together with MDRC, we were doing studies about what keeps people in community college over time. And one of the places, we were doing experiments all over the country, but one of the places we were working was in New Orleans. And when the hurricane hit, MDRC said, "Oh, our experiment is ruined, that's the end." But it turned out that Chris Paxson had added a whole bunch of questions at baseline and the one-year follow-up to this community college study on health, on mental health and physical health. So before the hurricane hit, we had this great data. So Jean Rhodes and Cece Rouse and Chris Paxson and I took on the project and got funding. And because people had signed up for a longitudinal study, we were able to find them wherever they went after the hurricane. So in order to qualify to be part of the community college study, people had to be young adults. They had to be a parent because the funding came from TANF money. They had to make under 200% of the poverty level, have a GED or high school degree, and no college degree. So they're not the poorest of the poor. They're the working poor who were trying to make something out of their life. Many of them actually signed up for the project and for community college and never showed up for the first day of community college. So they're not at all a highly successful group, but they are a striving group. So they were overwhelmingly African American, female. They were all parents. 70% were receiving government benefits at baseline, which was a year before the storm. They were disproportionately from the 9th Ward, and I'll show you that in a bit. So the larger study, as it has evolved, is looking at Katrina as a turning point in the longitudinal, in the life course of the young adults that we're studying. And what we've learned studying disasters is that resilience pretty much is the norm after a disaster, but there are differences between psychological, economic, and social resilience. And our data are particularly good for studying this because we have the pre-disaster data, and also because we can differentiate the recovery of the city from the recovery of the people who used to live in the city. The punchline right now of the study, and we've just applied for another 5 years of funding, which we hope we get so that we can continue, because we don't really know the ending of this story yet, is that a significant minority, about a third, are suffering ongoing mental health consequences, physical health consequences. It's not random who is continuing to suffer. Disaster benefits helped a lot of people get a leg up, but the question is how long they're going to be sustained. And relocation seems to be associated with both better neighborhoods and worse mental health. So just to remind you about Hurricane Katrina, it hit in 2005. The wind damage was significant, but the real problem happened after the levees broke, after the storm was over, when 80% of the city of New Orleans was flooded, with water levels reaching 20 feet in some places. People who study disasters make a distinction, and it turns out to be a very important distinction between a natural disaster and a man-made disaster. And there are more long-lasting consequences for psychological health from a man-made disaster than from a natural disaster. Katrina was both. It was both the natural disaster of the hurricane, but very much the man-made disaster of the break in the levees. So there were 1,800 deaths, 90,000 square miles was a disaster area equal to the entire landmass of the UK. 60% of the housing stock in New Orleans City was completely destroyed. More was damaged. And it displaced 600,000 people. Now, I'll show you just a couple of pictures. One of the things that's hard, I was there soon after the hurricane, and one of the hardest things to have visualized watching it on television was the absolute scope of the flood. So there you see, you see New Orleans in the background there. That's downtown New Orleans. And the flooding just went on for miles and miles. You could drive hours and still be in the flooding zone. This is just to remind you of what it was like for people at that time. The images that appeared on our television screens and then disappeared. And this is for people who went to PAA a couple of weeks ago. This is Canal Street looking towards our hotel. There's either the Sheraton or the Marriott, which are across the street from each other. And that's the flooding that was on the street. If you go to New Orleans now and you stay in the French Quarter or the Garden District, you don't see any evidence of the flood. If you get out into the neighborhoods, you can see it. This is just to orient you to New Orleans, the names of the neighborhoods. Orleans Parish is coterminous with the city of New Orleans. And there's Lakeview, which is one of the highest income neighborhoods of the city, and the French Quarter and the Garden District and uptown where Tulane is. Along the Mississippi River is the highest elevation in the city, so they got off the best. And between here and Lakeview and throughout New Orleans East is where a lot of the flooding was. Here is a map of the flooding. Here is the French Quarter, where many of us were a few weeks ago. The Mississippi River, the darker colors are the deeper floods, over 10 feet. And this is Lakeview. And here is the 9th Ward, which was one of the worst hit parts of the city. These are our respondents. Every dot is a respondent in our study. And the size of the black dots did not have flooding at their houses. They had a lot of wind damage, but the red dots are people who had flooding, and the size of the red dot is how deep the flooding was. So we had people, and the community college is right in this area right here. It was completely flooded, and the faculty had to live in FEMA trailers on the campus in the spring semester. So, as I said, this is a graph just of the population distribution of the wards in New Orleans, and this is the per capita income. And you can see that the blue bars are our respondents, and they are very much 40%, over 40% of our population was from the 9th Ward, overrepresented from the area that was hardest hit. So we had the baseline survey when people signed up to be at the community college, and then we were in the field when the hurricane hit, and had finished interviewing 492 people. The hurricane hit, they had to stop interviewing because of the evacuation. Soon after the hurricane, we found 82% of this original sample who had been interviewed. And then we went after the people who hadn't been interviewed before the storm. We found almost 60% of them. And then in 2009, 2010, we did another survey, and we found 71% of the original 1,000. And we have done qualitative interviews at each round. So we did qualitative interviews in 2006 and again in 2009, 2010. So our first question was, what does knowing people's mental health before the hurricane do in terms of helping you to predict health outcomes after the hurricane? So we looked at the data that we had on social resources, economic resources, and health resources, the experience of trauma during the hurricane, and then the outcomes. And we have a number of measures of hurricane trauma and loss. We have usual demographic characteristics, economic status. We had asked about social support, questions like, there are people I know who will help me when I need it. There is no one I feel comfortable talking about problems with. Before the hurricane, we had administered the K6, the Kessler scale on mental illness and depression, and we also had a stress scale. And then after the hurricane, we added the impact of event scale revised, the IESR, which measures probable PTSD. And we also have a number of measures of physical health. The Katrina traumas that we asked about was from a CDC scale. And there are a number of things that happened to people during the hurricane. I draw your attention to this question: were any of your relatives or close friends killed because of Hurricane Katrina or Rita? 31% of our respondents said yes. Since the number of deaths was kind of small for the whole metro area, we were a little worried about this, but there was a follow-up question. And it was elderly relatives in a lot of cases, or neighbors. So we're actually pretty confident that that's a real number. At the end of a survey, they often end a survey by saying, is there anything else you'd like to tell us? Right? So in the first year after the hurricane, we recorded, and they only record the first number of characters. But if you read this, you can see some of the things that people went through, that they were just really dying to tell us about. It was horrible. Water had to be boiled. She has 4 small children and a puppy. Had a baby. It was hard. The helicopters didn't pick them up. We're stranded on the roof, etc. This one is the one that we haven't been able to find this woman, but baby was born at 26 weeks on the roof of the house, surrounded by water. Baby didn't survive. So people lived through incredibly traumatic experiences during the hurricane. Everything from people who evacuated but didn't know about other family members to people who were at the convention center, saw dead bodies, waded through water and dead bodies, etc. So from the first wave, prevalence of serious mental illness doubled, and this was pretty similar to other more population-based surveys that were done in New Orleans, from about 7% before the hurricane to 14% afterwards. There was an increase in reports of negative health, and nearly half of the respondents reported probable PTSD. And these were associated with higher levels of loss and trauma, and controlling for baseline socioeconomic characteristics and health measures, there were still very measurable increases in negative outcomes. Baseline resources, such as having a car, income, or social support, protected people from experiencing traumas, but if you did experience the trauma, it did not lessen the results of that trauma. So if you had access to a working car, you could get out and not experience some of the worst of the trauma. But if you did experience trauma, you had the same negative mental health outcomes as people who did not have high baseline socioeconomic or social support. The inclusion of sociodemographic controls didn't have much impact on the coefficients. Pre-Katrina health reduces the measurement of psychological distress by about 20%. So this is the big question that is always asked after a disaster, which is, are people depressed because of the disaster, or were they depressed before the disaster? And this is just, we're just picking that up. And what we found was that it was about 20% reduced if you knew what their situation was before the disaster. Interestingly, the K6 was related to earlier K6 measurements, but the results for PTSD symptoms did not change too much with pre-Katrina health, but they did. They were related to the amount of damage to your home and the amount of trauma that you experienced. So then we went back in 2009 and 2010 and looked at how people were doing that. And about 70%, this is just looking at the K6 scale, were doing well. They either had high K6 scores and now were doing better, or they had not ever had a problem. And 30% were suffering. So about a third, a little bit less than a third, were still showing evidence of problems. Psychological distress in 2009 and 2010 was highly influenced by traumas and knowing somebody who died, the number of Katrina traumas you experienced. And social support at baseline was related to high psychological stress at 4 or 5 years out. So there was now an effect of social support down the road. PTSD, we find a third of people, a third of people are reporting PTSD. Delayed 10%, chronic 23%. I gave this talk in Washington in front of somebody who works with the Veterans Administration. And he said, he told me that the VA is still having people who are reporting to VA hospitals from World War II with the very first onset of PTSD. These men are in their 80s and 90s and their wife dies and they suddenly have PTSD symptoms from World War II. So he was basically saying people who had experienced something like this, another trigger can come along and cause them to have it very, very delayed, which I'm trying to make an argument for why they should give me more money to keep following these people in the future. I don't know if it'll work. So high PTSD in 2009 and 2010 was related to home damage, and it was the effects of having a family member or friend die had decreased from the first follow-up to the second follow-up, and mental health problems before the hurricane now seem to be influencing PTSD at time 2. So the other things that we've been looking at are post-traumatic growth. So psychologists have a scale of post-traumatic growth in which basically people interpret what has happened to them. And it's a scale that's been used in a lot of situations. And it's basically about making lemonade from lemons. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So relating to others, new possibilities, spiritual change, I have a stronger religious faith, appreciation of life. So we've been looking at post-traumatic growth, and remarkably, it has been measured by a lot of psychologists and was not related, they didn't have good measures of PTSD. We have found that it is very strongly related to having PTSD, i.e. you have to have had this kind of very negative experience to be having this measured growth. And we're finding that personality variables that we measured at baseline are highly predictive of post-traumatic growth, especially metacognition. So the ability to think about yourself seems to be highly influential to developing post-traumatic growth. We've done a number of studies on religion. Now, I personally, being a very bad person, would have thought if everything I owned was destroyed by a hurricane that I would be pretty mad at God. But it turns out that most people report that they have higher religious belief after the hurricane. That instead of being mad at God, they're actually finding solace in God and report higher levels of spirituality. But we asked a series in the follow-up, we asked a series of questions about how you think about who God is, and do you see God as a punitive God or somebody who's quite loving, and whether or not God punishes people. And we find that this is highly correlated, I don't know which direction the causation goes, with a negative psychological functioning. So if you think that God is a punishing God, and God was punishing you somehow with the hurricane, you have negative psychological consequences from that. So, New Orleans has changed in fundamental ways, and one of the things that we're able to do is to look at the recovery of the city and the recovery of the people. So, only 13% of our sample members reported no moves between baseline and all waves of the survey. And there's a lot of moving across tracks and also out of the area. And individuals who are homeowners and whose homes had not been flooded, as you might imagine, were the least likely to move. But there was really a diaspora of people. So Katrina was New Orleans was a city that had been losing population for a long time before Katrina. Like Detroit, it was a slowly dying city. And the city now is very much changed. And the narrative that you'll read about the city is that it's better than ever. And the reality is that it's a very uneven recovery, and the population in New Orleans is changing radically. So these are some slides done by one of the other PIs, Beth Fussell. And this is just using census data. You can see that 1950 was the heyday of New Orleans, and it had slowly been losing population until the hurricane hit, and then it lost population very quickly. This is Orleans Parish, which is New Orleans. You can see the precipitous decline with the hurricane, and then the recovery, which is not anywhere near where it was before. So post-Katrina New Orleans is older, richer, and whiter. So this is just the percent change in age groups from 2005 using ACS data. And what you can see is that in 2007, a lot of people are still gone. The population is rebounding. Whether or not it's the same people, of course, you don't know from the ACS. But you can see that young people are coming back less than older people. And the city, the poor are not as numerous after 2005, and the income distribution is changing. So higher income people are more likely to be moving in or coming back. There are also whites are almost at their level that they were before the hurricane. Blacks have not been recovering, and Hispanics have been coming into the city. So New Orleans is changing. It's lost some of its African American population, gained whites, and especially Hispanics, who there have been very few in New Orleans before the hurricane. So this is just another way of looking at it, that African Americans were much less likely to be in New Orleans after the hurricane. They now have a white mayor. It's changing electoral politics in New Orleans as well. So this is the spatial distribution of our respondents in the 1-year follow-up after Katrina. So some are back in the New Orleans area, but they're all over the place. And they're kind of similar to the FEMA. This is the FEMA applications for assistance in the 1 year after the hurricane. People went all over the country. But the question is, who comes back and where do they settle? So in 2009, 2010, only 13% of our people had not moved at all. 35% were back in the city. 25% were elsewhere in Louisiana, and 40% of our sample was in another state. They were in 31 states with the largest concentration in Texas. This is really remarkable. New Orleans actually had one of the least mobile populations in the country before Katrina. Many of the people we interviewed had never been outside of New Orleans before they left. And it was a very, very, very big change for them. And they've been scattered in lots of different places. So the decision about whether to return is influenced by many factors. Housing, of course, and I'll tell you a little bit about how housing has changed. Jobs, community and family is incredibly important to people. All of them are parents, so they're making decisions about children and schools, but also culture and belonging. So in 2009 and 10, when we found people, 23% were in a residence that had been in existence before Katrina. 60% were in a new home. 6%, this is 4 to 5 years after the hurricane, were still in a FEMA trailer or a shelter or a hotel. 10% were living with family, friends, or in another temporary arrangement. The average number of moves was 3.6, and the average displacement was 130 days. By the way, I'll put up the URL, but all the papers that this are based on are on our website, so that all of these papers you can find. It turns out we looked at, I'm not going to go into it, but we looked at the children and children's behavior and children's outcomes. The number of moves was highly significant for the children's functioning, and with more moves, there were less good outcomes for the children. Now, Arnie Duncan recently went to New Orleans, and he said, let me be honest, I think the best thing that happened to the education system in New Orleans was Hurricane Katrina. That education system was a disaster, and it took Hurricane Katrina to wake up the community to say we have to do better. And the progress that they've made in 4 years since the hurricane is unbelievable. New Orleans, none of the schools reopened for a year after, none of the public schools reopened. So the kids who were back in New Orleans just didn't go to school for a long period. A lot of them lost a year's worth of schooling. The schools now are all charter schools, and so they revamped the educational system in New Orleans. There was a stimulus effect of the federal money that flowed in after the disaster. And so at first, New Orleans was not hit by the recession as strongly as other parts of the country. Recovery spending, I just want to point out, federal spending was about $120 billion. And while philanthropic giving was good, it still was a very small amount compared to the federal that went into New Orleans, and private insurance claims, and there's many, many stories about this, but a lot of people had a lot of trouble getting insurance to pay for claims on their lost housing. So what happened is that the stimulus money went in. A lot of people came to the city to work in construction. That's when immigrants and Hispanic immigrants started to come into the city. And jobs actually were better available in that period of rebuilding. And you can see here, this is the job growth and loss. You see the effect right after increase, and then it goes down. And so now it's about back at baseline, so that there was the stimulus effect, and the recession kind of caught up with New Orleans. When we looked at the long-term educational outcomes of our young women, now remember they were attempting to go to community college. The community college that we were studying reopened, but it shifted most, I think a majority of its courses to online courses, and people also re-enrolled in colleges wherever they had moved. But 7% never showed up for a day of college, even though they had intended to. 84% have no degree. 13% have gotten an AA. That's actually higher than the graduation rate of Delgado, which is 7%, or was 7% before the hurricane. And 35% report that they are currently enrolled. Employment went down for people who left New Orleans, and they had a bit of a time getting re-employed. They lived in cities with pretty similar unemployment rates, and compared to those who were able to stay in New Orleans, those who had relocated had a substantial setback in employment rates. But then when we went back 4 years later, the employment rates were not much difference between those who were back in New Orleans and those who were not. Ordinary benefits increased slightly in terms of federal benefits that people were eligible for, but it was the extraordinary benefits that allowed people to try to restart their lives. So if you look at TANF cash benefits, food stamps, the red is 5 years, so it's comparing 2003 and 2010. And there's not a great difference, although more people are employed and able to, or were able to take advantage of the long-term unemployment insurance. It was the road home money and especially the FEMA rental subsidies that made a big difference to people as they relocated. Now, as I said, the narrative about New Orleans is that it's better than ever. The city now has its lowest poverty rate that it's had since 1979. All of the public housing in New Orleans was blown up and redone as mixed income housing. And so and rents have tripled in the city since the hurricane. So people who were renters and people who were in public housing have had the hardest time coming back. Let me see. So when we look at the neighborhood characteristics of where people are in the first year after the hurricane, we find that they're in significantly better neighborhoods. Now remember, 40% of them started out in the 9th Ward, or 45% of them, and it's hard to find a worse neighborhood in terms of many of the ways in which we measure neighborhoods. So the new neighborhoods that people are in have less people in poverty, less people with public assistance, less female-headed households, and they're more integrated. So let me just show you this. The gray is pre-Katrina, the blue is post-Katrina, and then the red is in 2010. Now this is everybody, including people who are back in New Orleans, and New Orleans itself is changing over time. So some of these are not a result of change, they're just the result of outcomes, but all of them, all of the neighborhoods are better over time. Those people who were flooded, though, and who moved showed the biggest increase in their neighborhood attainments. So the flooded people, and especially flooded people who left Louisiana, show remarkable differences in their neighborhoods. So this is just showing that the flooding was not random in terms of who was affected. So neighborhoods that were the neighborhoods that were flooded tended to be more African American neighborhoods with higher poverty rates, higher public assistance, and higher unemployment. So the flooding itself was not random, even though Lakeview was one of the higher income neighborhoods. The flooding disproportionately affected poor neighborhoods. Basically, people who were flooded and who were forced to move ended up in neighborhoods that had significantly less poverty and were more integrated. And then, over time, are moving to neighborhoods that are more segregated and have higher poverty. So when we go back and find them in 2010, some of the neighborhoods tend to be less poverty than the ones that we found 1 year afterwards. One of the things that's very striking for the women that we interviewed is the increase in living with immigrants. New Orleans, as I said, had not too many immigrants. They were relocated, a lot of them, to Houston and Dallas, where they experienced a lot of diversity for the first time, living with Hispanics for the first time. And then there was the influx of the foreign-born into New Orleans. I'm going to go quickly through this. I want to say a little bit, Beth Fussell and Sarah Lowe have looked at housing trajectories. So for people, they've looked at how, what happened to you after the hurricane in terms of your housing patterns have led to different kinds of outcomes for people. So they did latent class profiles of probabilities or of trajectories of housing, and they come up with three trajectories, three classes. One is relocated people. It's about half the sample. They're in a new home, in a new state. They spent less number of days in interim housing. They tend to be more likely to be public housing or Section 8 renters at baseline, and they report higher PTSD and higher depression, but better neighborhoods. Okay, so the people who are relocated and kind of more stably relocated in neighborhoods have worse mental health problems, but better neighborhood attainment. The unstably housed seem to have traded proximity to New Orleans for stable housing. So they are in temporary housing. They're more likely to be living with friends and relatives. They have more longer period in interim housing, and they report more physical health, negative physical health conditions. And the returned are the people who are doing the best in terms of psychological outcomes and physical outcomes, and they tend to be the people who are homeowners, who had less damage to their home. They're less likely to be flooded, and they're able to rebuild their lives in New Orleans or in its suburbs. So the benefits allowed people to live in more expensive housing in the first 2 years after the hurricane, but when we included the qualitative data, we found why many of them ended up giving up some of the things that they had gained to go back to New Orleans. They reported discrimination against Katrina survivors. They spent a lot of time trying to actually mask that they were from New Orleans because they felt like people wouldn't give them jobs, or they would be mean to their children because they would think that they were the underclass who were bringing guns and crime into their neighborhoods. They reported missing the distinctive culture of New Orleans, not being able to get gumbo, and missing the parades, et cetera, and the food. difficulty adjusting to the new environment where there were people that they were speaking another language, people that they didn't know, and especially missing the social support of family, friends, and neighbors. Here's a woman who describes what it was like to get on the bus from the convention center. A lot of these people, they really didn't have anything. They had no means of transportation, so they couldn't move. They couldn't go anywhere but where they sent them. And they sent them there, to Houston. I mean, it was sort of like the people getting put on the train going with the Holocaust, not knowing where they're going, just know they're heading for trouble when they got there. It was a disaster. So many of the people report that they had better job opportunities, although that's not borne out in our analysis of their employment, less crime. Every single person who we talked to outside of New Orleans said the schools were better for their children. But they felt that they were missing their strong ties to their family, and this made them want to go back. Many people described, of the people who were the sort of settled in Houston and Dallas, described Hurricane Katrina and this part of this kind of growth, that Katrina came and it was God's opportunity to get us away from bad things, a fresh new start, a brand new life. And they described this as giving them the push to get out of their neighborhood that they wanted all along. I don't have time to go all through this. Let me just, this is the part I like the most. Okay. Let me just go to this one. I think this quote really sums up the people who are the settled people outside of the city. If I go back to New Orleans, I know that economically it's not good right now because everything is just not functioning properly, so that was going to be bad. But if I stayed here, things were looking up as far as job-wise, opportunity-wise, but my family's not here. It's boring. I'm lonely. It doesn't even feel the same at all. It just feels like I'm just here. So I can go somewhere here, but no one is here with me. But New Orleans is fun. I know people. I'm comfortable. I'm not going to go anywhere, get anywhere. I'm like, so that's my little battle. And we heard this over and over again. People who felt compelled to go back and yet felt like they might be better off if they could stay. So those who returned, and I didn't have time to get into it, but those who returned, in some sense, were feeling a lot of regrets because they came back looking for this sense of rootedness, and they didn't find it as much as they had hoped to. And in part, that's because it's very much a market-based recovery in New Orleans. If you had insurance, if you had a mortgage that required you to go back to your house, you went back. But if you drive in some neighborhoods of New Orleans, you'll find one house on a block that's been redone, and the other houses are abandoned, and the people are not coming back. So people are coming back for that sense of community and that sense of connection that they wanted, but when they come back, they find that they're not getting what they thought they were going to get. I think that there are a lot of analogies coming from an immigration perspective with the refugee experience, this same longing for home, this recognition that home might not be the same thing when you get back there. People feeling completely excluded because the rents have tripled and the public housing is not available, that even if they made the decision to go back, they can't. And I think there's a lot of policy issues and issues for future disasters that come up from all of this study. But if I was going to highlight one, it's that we tend not to take community into account after disasters. And this is a long-standing finding in sociological studies of disaster. Kai Erikson wrote about this in his study of the flood in West Virginia, that what people need after a disaster are the connections with other people who have gone through it. And when we don't put people together in community to respond, and some communities in New Orleans were better able to stay connected, those that had social capital and economic resources were better able to connect on the internet and to come back all together, but a lot of people reported to us that they were isolated. In fact, one of the papers that came out of the study is called Praying Alone, and it was one of the saddest kind of images, which is that many of the women reported that they couldn't get to a church in Houston or Dallas that they felt comfortable with, so that they would watch the TV preachers and pray alone in their apartments. And it just really encapsulated how isolated they felt after time. So one of my goals in talking about this project here is that we have way more data than we can make sense of. And we are really looking for smart people who want to work on this. And any of you who are inspired on this should talk to me, because we have a lot of data and are looking for smart people who might want to work on it. So thank you very much.